Good afternoon. Authors at Google New York is pleased to have with us today Stephen Johnson, the author of Future Perfect, The Case for Progress in a Networked Age. Stephen Johnson is the author of several bestsellers, including Where Good Ideas Come From, The Invention of Air, my personal favorite, The Ghost Map, and Everything Bad is Good for You. He is also the editor of the anthology, The Innovator's Cookbook. He is the founder of a variety of websites, most recently Outside.in, and he writes for Time, Wired, and the New York Times. Please welcome Stephen Johnson.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. This is day 3 of the book tour for Future Perfect. So I'm at that lovely stage where I'm still excited to listen to myself talk about this book. In a couple of weeks, I'll be very tired of my own voice on this topic. This is a very optimistic book, and already just in this first week, I'm realizing how odd that seems to people now. I did an interview on NPR last week where they started the interview saying our next guest is an actual optimist. I was like a giant panda they'd found somewhere, and they were kind of amazed at it. And I think probably inside a company like Google and inside the tech sector, we're much more likely to find people who feel as though there is progress going on in the world and that there's reason for optimism. But when we kind of get outside of that realm, you see a lot of people who are not so optimistic about the future. And so this is a book that is making the case for reasons to be encouraged and enthusiastic about our kind of prospects ahead. But it's specifically a political book. It's my first real foray into the political conversation in a kind of explicit way. But it's not a political book in the mode that most political books seem to be written these days, which is one side bashing the other side. And it's not really about existing kind of political parties, but rather it's an attempt to kind of map out what I see as this new emerging worldview, a vision of how we make progress, how we continue progress and social good around us, that I've been seeing everywhere I look in all these people and organizations over the last 5 or 10 years. And it's trying to make the case that there is a coherent kind of political philosophy that is emerging in these different groups, one that is different from the traditional viewpoints of the left and the right. It's not a centrist argument, because I think what I'm arguing for is quite different. So it is an argument, and what I want to do today is just kind of walk you through the stages of the argument. There are kind of 4 primary stages and tell you some stories along the way as kind of case studies and how this stuff works. The first kind of rung of the argument is this. We have a set of institutions in society that, while they vary in case to case in many ways, they are coherent enough as a type that we talk about them as kind of categories. So we talk about a corporation, we talk about the marketplace, we talk about the government or the state. And we all know there are like many instances of corporations that behave very differently. They're employee-owned corporations, they're corporations with lots of participation that are not particularly hierarchical the way in many ways Google is. They're very top-down corporations, just as there are various different kinds of governments, local, state, federal, and so on. But we've agreed as a society that those institutions as a group are kind of coherent enough that we can refer to them as the government or the state or the private sector or the marketplace. And we have a set of kind of political philosophies that are predicated on the various kind of ratios of influence of those different institutions. So if we're on the left, we think that the state should have a strong force in society and provide a safety net and so forth. And if we're on the right, we think that the market should be unleashed to do as much as it should. And in general, the political conversation is an attempt to figure out, how do you balance those two kind of competing forces. What I'm trying to argue is that for a long time now, there has been another social architecture, another institution that has been working in the world and providing actually a lot of the kind of fuel for social progress in our world, but that has become increasingly important in the last 20 or 30 years. And that organization is what I'm calling the peer network, just as a kind of simplified way of describing it from peer-to-peer network. And actually, the easiest way to think about the power and importance of this organizational structure is to to actually think about the internet itself and the web itself. And this actually gets us directly into the presidential political conversation that's happening right now. I wrote a little bit about this in the Times Magazine this weekend. In the "You Didn't Build That" speech, which was until last week the most controversial speech of the political season, President Obama was talking about how entrepreneurs, while they build a business, are nonetheless reliant on all sorts of infrastructure that is provided for them by the government. So they didn't build the roads that their businesses use, and they didn't build a lot of the technological infrastructure that they rely on, and that is something that the government has provided. And the line after the notorious "You didn't build that" line was actually specifically about the history of the internet. It said, quote unquote, "Government built the internet so that businesses then could make money off the internet." That was kind of the sequence, and that was the description. Now, shortly after that quote appeared, the Wall Street Journal ran this kind of contrarian op-ed that said, actually, the government's role in the invention of the internet was greatly overstated, and in fact, it was really the private sector that did it. And it was no accident that the internet had kind of languished for 20 years in relative obscurity until the private sector jumped on it, including companies like Google. And so there's kind of this argument kind of debunking the government built the internet story. Now, we understand from what we were just saying at the beginning why this matters. If you're on the left, and if you can show that the government played an important role in innovating and creating this platform that then actually encouraged business, well, then that's a great defender of kind of progressive left values. The government actually is not just a safety net, it's a driver of change and innovation. If you're on the right, if you can show that the government actually, as they called it in the Wall Street Journal, that it was an urban myth that the internet had been created by the government, well, then that just keeps your kind of libertarian ideals intact. But if you think about the actual organizations that built the internet, and certainly that built the web, and many of the other kind of key elements of code that our infrastructure is now based on, I think the most important thing here that is lost is that there was this different organizational structure that was maybe the most important at all, which is this loose, decentralized affiliation of largely kind of computer scientists around the world, collaborating in an open way, building on each other's ideas without private ownership of their ideas, without patents, sharing and building on, in a collaborative network, the kind of core ideas. Funded by the government, for sure. Funded by kind of visionary early government spending that allowed them to build these collaborative networks. But very few people who were actually working on the internet in its formative years were working inside a government agency. They were almost all outside, many of them in universities, and they were working really in that venerable tradition of kind of open source, peer-reviewed science, where they were taking ideas and saying, that's a great idea and I can improve it, I can improve it. No one was holding any kind of proprietary claim over those ideas. And what's true about the internet is even more true of the web. I mean, it wasn't like there was a big kind of DARPA research project that led directly to the creation of the web. And so if you think about it, you think about all the technology and all the code out there that has been produced by these kinds of peer networks, whether they're kind of government-funded research or whether it's open source software, whether it's things like Wikipedia. And think about how essential all those things have now become to our lives today. I mean, in the time space this weekend, I had this little thought experiment, which is if you could somehow, if you were like some Dr. Evil and you wanted to, if you could create this targeted magnetic pulse that would cause every bit of peer-produced code to, kind of shut off on the planet. I mean, imagine the magnitude of that event. You would see just, the internet would go down, the web would go down, the markets would go down, potentially the energy sector, aviation, whole parts of the world would go dark overnight. It would be a global catastrophe on the scale of a pandemic or something like that. And that shows how much that kind of peer network structure of open collaboration has shaped our world today. The state and the private sector are now dependent on the products of that labor. Now, in the context of a company like Google, you all probably take some variation of this for granted. But the point here is that if we'd been having this conversation 30 years ago with most people in the world, I now live in Northern California, in Marin County, California, and if I showed up, in 1971 or something like that and said, we're going to build this new set of products using collaborative, non-proprietary labor with no traditional ownership relationships, where we're going to get together and share ideas and build things. Most people would have said, absolutely, I'm sure on your commune in Northern California, you're really going to make some beautiful baskets. We look forward to seeing these products, right? People would have said, that's not really how the real world works. Real things don't get built in that kind of way. The marketplace, you have to have private property and you have to have all this stuff. Here we are now, 40 years later, and we see that this stuff works. And then, in fact, a huge part of our daily lives are now dependent on precisely that kind of peer network collaboration. So what we're talking about here is not some utopian fantasy. It is not some collectivist dream from a grad school seminar on radical thought. I mean, it is a practical reality that we can point to now and say this works in the real world. And in many cases, it has outperformed offerings that were created, competing offerings that were created by the private sector. So that's the beginning. The first scaffolding is that there is this structure of the peer network which deserves to be considered alongside that of the kind of top-down corporation or the top-down government agency. The second stage then is that kind of structure embodied in code can be used to solve other kinds of problems, not just the problems of organizing and connecting all the minds and all the information in the world, but other kinds of problems. And the best example of this in the last couple of years is one, Wikipedia, obviously, which is the attempt to use peer networks to solve the problem of how do you create a global encyclopedia. If 15 years ago we were having this conversation and someone said, I think we could all collectively build a global encyclopedia that will rival or exceed Britannica in quality and greatly exceed it in terms of the scope and comprehensiveness of the encyclopedia, even the true believers in the room probably would have said, yeah, that's not really going to happen. I think that's unlikely. And yet it happened, and it's real, and it's there. The other great example from New York is Kickstarter. Right? Kickstarter is an attempt to solve the problem of how do you fund creative work? How do you fund interesting experimental artistic work that is not yet getting supported by the traditional kind of venues of the market? We have decided as a society long ago that it's important to support creative work when it's in that more experimental stage, when it doesn't yet have the kind of private sector backing. And that's why we have big institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts or big philanthropic institutions like the Duke Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation and so on. We don't have a national endowment for the detergents because we've decided that the private sector is very good at coming up with laundry materials. But we do have a national endowment for the arts because we feel that artists need a little extra help, right? And we think it's good as a society to support those ideas so that they can spread and turn into kind of even more interesting ideas. Up until recently, the way that you kind of funded your experimental projects was either you kept your day job or you went to a big organization like the National Endowment for the Arts or the Duke Foundation and you tried to get a grant, and a small number of decision makers inside those big organizations would make a decision of whether to support your project or not. Well, Kickstarter came along and they said, wait a second, the world is filled with people who probably would be willing to give $10 or $50 to support an interesting project, even if they aren't technically investing in the project, even if they don't see a commercial return from that investment if the project takes off. And so they went out and created this platform. And what's interesting about Kickstarter actually is it's an example of a for-profit company. It's a venture-backed startup that's probably going to make a tidy return for its investors. But what it creates is this kind of peer network gift economy where people are proposing projects and funding projects without traditional commercial relationships, right? There's not by the kind of bylaws of the system, there is not a investment relationship. There's no ROI measured by kind of traditional accounts in the Kickstarter structure. But here we are now, and you all know this as well as I do. Here we are now, 3 or 4 years later, and Kickstarter is on track to give away more money to artists this year than the entire budget of the National Endowment for the Arts. So the question is no longer, is Kickstarter is it ever possible that it would be as big as the NEA? The question is Kickstarter going to be 10 times bigger than the NEA? And that's not an argument for doing away with the NEA. It is maybe an argument for making the NEA work a little bit more like Kickstarter. But what it effectively does, and this is the kind of the key to so many of these types of organizations, is that it decentralizes and diversifies and densifies the number of people who are involved in the decision-making process of which creative work should get funded and which shouldn't. And there is a decision. I mean, less than 50% of Kickstarter projects get funded. So it's not as if it's anything goes. There is a kind of selection process, which is crucial to these systems. There has to be a way of kind of separating the kind of the signal from the noise, just as PageRank figured out this way of, in a decentralized way of figuring out what was quality on the internet and what was not. But they've greatly expanded the pool of people who are involved in that decision-making process. So instead of these very top-down, very small number of decision makers who are funding creative work before, now we have this much wider net. And what it is about is this kind of gift economy exchange. So again, we have this situation where using the technology, creating peer networks, solves a problem and does it in this really extraordinary way and actually unlocks all this kind of energy and enthusiasm that wasn't there before. So that's using the technology of a peer network to solve a different kind of problem. In the case of Kickstarter, it's arts funding. But the key thing that I want to stress here, particularly in a context like that of Google, is that these aren't necessarily all high-tech solutions. I'm not optimistic in a kind of cyber utopian sense. There's not the sense of like, okay, if we could just like throw the internet at people and get them on their Android phones, the world will be better. In fact, in many cases, I think the peer network architecture can work just as well in very low-tech environments without a lot of technology. The internet makes it easier to form these kinds of structures, in part because it kind of lowers the organizational costs of forming groups, as Clay Shirky has argued over the years. But I think it's just important to point out that there are kind of face-to-face, real-world applications of peer networks too, and I'll tell you just about two of them. One involves a great story from about 15 years ago with a couple, Jerry and Monique Sternin, who were asked by Save the Children to go and look at childhood malnutrition in the rice paddy kind of communities in Vietnam. And the traditional way that you deal with this problem in kind of a developing world context is you send people over, you've got children who aren't getting enough nourishment. And so, one solution is you just take a bunch of food and you kind of chopper it in and deliver it and say, here, you should eat more of this. And then you go, which is obviously not a sustainable solution to the problem. The other way is to kind of come in as an outside expert and be like, this is what you should be eating, you should be doing this more, here's a big lecture, we're going to try and make sure that you do this. But the approach that these guys took was that they decided to actually solve it in a decidedly kind of peer network bottom-up way. They said, inside this community, in the kind of diverse set of approaches to feeding your children that exist in this extended community, there are going to be people who actually have figured out a way, given the existing conditions that they live in, to have healthier, better-fed children. And so what we need to do is not come in from the outside with a bunch of solutions or an outside set of supplies of food, but we need to figure out a way within this network of people to unlock these strategies that they've already kind of stumbled across or found knowingly on their own. And so the first thing they did was they went in and they just weighed the children, right? They just went around with scales and went from neighborhood to community and figured out, what are the kids who are actually doing well? What are the kids who are the least malnourished in this community? And they called these the positive deviants. These are the ones who were kind of deviating from the norm in a positive way. And so they found these outliers, these positive deviants, and then they did this kind of on-the-ground ethnographic thick research where they tried to figure out what was it about the diets and the kind of routines of these families that were helping them to have these healthier children in this particular specific context. And they found there were these clear recurring patterns, one of which is that they were being fed rice in small meals throughout the day rather than just a couple of big meals, which was helping their kind of stomach basically there's only so much rice a small stomach can take in. And so they were having these little incremental snacks through the day. But the most important thing they found is that they were feeding, the positive deviants were feeding their kids little crustaceans, little shrimp that were in the kind of swampy areas of the rice paddies, which had been largely seen as kind of a low-class food and most of the other families kind of shunned that stuff and just fed their kids rice. But in fact, because there were kind of additional vitamins and proteins that were in these little crustaceans, the kids were getting a much more kind of richer, more balanced diet. So once they'd figured out what the strategies were, which were already there in the community, instead of broadcasting that out to the group, they again used the peer network structure to spread the word. So they had the families themselves that had adopted these kind of dietary policies. The families themselves hosted potluck dinners for the rest of the community, and everybody came and they sat and they kind of, the families that had adopted this kind of showed their peers in the community and cooked for them, basically. Gave them the meals that they were preparing for their kids. And so word spread organically, was being pushed along and kind of amplified by the outside agency. But the knowledge and the kind of gossip about that knowledge that spread through the community spread through the peer network itself in a kind of bottom-up way. And what they found was there was a short-term decrease in malnutrition, but the key thing was they went back a generation later and they saw the same positive news. It had stuck in that community. It wasn't just a kind of a one-time thing. They left, came back 10, 15 years later, and the kids were still better fed. And so it had become part of the kind of habits of the community. The positive deviance had become the new norm in that world. So that's an example of how peer networks can work without technology. I mean, the most advanced technology they used in that was a scale, effectively, right? The other example, and here is where I think the most opportunity exists for this kind of social change, and that is on the kind of the level of location and neighborhoods and communities and local governance. So in the late 80s in Porto Alegre in Brazil, a city that had kind of terrible growing pains, that it's gone from 200,000 people to 2 million people in a short amount of time, and they had these vast shanty towns and favelas without running water or access to a sewer or electricity, and so they're just a city that was really growing at an incredible clip and was having a hard time keeping up with it all. In 1989, they instituted this really extraordinary approach, which they called participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting is the idea that there's a certain significant slice of kind of taxpayer dollars each year that is held aside for the local communities to decide directly how it should be spent. So every year, neighborhoods around the city get together and they have these kind of local referendums where they talk about the needs of the neighborhood, they talk about the community, they talk about what's working, what's not working. And through the end of this process, they create a ranked list of things they want funded, whether it's bringing the sewer to this part of the neighborhood, or adding another room to the schoolhouse, or building a community garden or park. And that list is then presented to the city and the state, and projects get funded with a slight bias towards neighborhoods that have less resources, so that the system is it doesn't just go to the wealthiest neighborhoods. And what they found was almost immediately that this approach was much more effective. It had a couple of really positive effects. The first was that it greatly reduced the amount of kind of corruption and waste in the process, because when the neighborhood itself was proposing something they wanted built, and they had a mechanism to say, yes, we want to have this playground here, when that playground didn't show up for 6 months or a year, there was an immediate sense that something was wrong. Whereas if the project had been kind of greenlit by some bureaucrat that no one ever really knew, they wouldn't really notice that something was missing. So it was much harder for money to just get lost, or projects to get kind of infinitely postponed. And so they saw this dramatic increase in a whole number of metrics about roads being built or sewer pipes being connected and so on. The other thing that happened, though, is that it created this positive feedback loop where people got involved in the process. They showed up and were engaged in these kind of neighborhood referenda. And from that engagement, they ended up seeing results, right? That 6 months later, this thing that they wanted was actually built. And so it created this positive feedback loop of engagement, of people saying, okay, I can get involved and things will improve. I'll see the results right away. So participatory budgeting is now spreading really across the world. It's in over 10% of city budgets in Europe involve significant participatory budgeting approaches. And it's now coming, there are experiments with it here in Brooklyn and in Chicago and other cities around the US. So it's a very powerful kind of mode. And it's not hard to imagine how you could take a model like that and kind of layer a Kickstarter style approach on top of it. In fact, there are a lot of really interesting companies that are starting to do this. Some of them for profit, some of them nonprofits, companies like Neighborland and Neighborly and SeeClickFix. And the basic idea is you say, okay, you've got this community of folks in a neighborhood. They know better than anybody else. They are the true experts. They know where the problems are and where the opportunities are. They know what the needs are. They know what's not working, what is working, where the little kind of impasses are in that community. And if you give them a platform, one, that enables that peer network to identify problems and needs, then and other members of the community to kind of vote on or rank those problems and needs. Say, okay, yes, you're right. You have pointed out that we need another stop sign there, and I'm going to endorse that in some fashion. So you have a peer network to kind of identify the needs of the community. Then you have another layer of network to propose solutions to those problems. So there's an abandoned lot in the neighborhood. Somebody proposes building a beer garden there. Somebody proposes paving it over. Somebody proposes building a condo. Somebody proposes making a community garden. Somebody, all these different proposals kind of come in. And along the Brazilian model, people can vote on those proposals, maybe even fund them directly. Maybe it's a Kickstarter model where they're saying, yes, in fact, I would like to see that, and here's $100 to contribute to it. Maybe they have kind of voucher-like economics where they have a certain slice of their taxes that they're paying into the city that they can allocate towards projects that they want to support or want to be a part of. And so you have these kind of layered peer networks here where both the identification and the kind of the solving of the problem are created by the community itself. In some cases, there may be cities involved in that process. In some cases, there may be private sector forces involved in that process. In some cases, they're just local communities. One of my favorite stories, actually, that's not in the book that I just came across the other day, is a story about this guy, Mark Lakeman, in Portland, who lived in Oregon on this kind of semi-anonymous residential street in Portland. I think it's the intersection of Sherritt Street and 9th Street, I think it was. And he lived there for a few years, and it was just a classic, kind of residential street where there's an intersection where nothing ever happened, and just kind of owned by the cars. And he went on a trip actually to Central America, and he kind of came back and he realized that throughout human history, and particularly in these more traditional societies, crossroads were a core location of kind of civic culture, where streets came together. That was where a community would gather and do interesting things, and where there was this kind of strong tradition of civic bonding that would happen. And he looked out at the intersection by his house, and there was just nothing. It was dead. And so he said, how can we make this space more interesting? How can we actually create kind of a community and something distinctive about this otherwise generic intersection? And so he decided the first thing to do was to paint it. So he wanted to create this very elaborate, kind of intersection-wide, even slightly larger, slightly psychedelic-looking painting. And he got his neighbors on board. He said, I think it'll be great. It'll be a space. It'll have some definition to it. And so he went to the city of Portland and initially went to the transportation department, and they were like, you can't do that. And they actually said, that's not allowed. That's public space. No one can use it. That was the quote. And which is very nice and Orwellian. So then he finally actually got the attention of the mayor's office, and they kind of actually got excited about it. And so they built this thing. They ended up starting to call it Sherritt Square, as in sharing, rather than Sherritt, which was spelled with an E. And after building this thing, it became this little gathering place, and they created a little solar-powered 24-hour tea station. So you get a little tea, and they created a little lending library where people could drop off books and pick up books, and a few other things. This is classic Portland, Oregon kind of story. But and all of a sudden, all these other intersections around the city, and then in Seattle and in other places, started to be inspired by that, and they started creating this thing called, with a little kind of manual called intersection repair. It was how to take this dead thing that you live next to and turn it into something that the community actually owned and felt like they had some identity there. And now they have a whole organization called City Repair that's encouraging things like that. So that kind of model of allowing people at the local level to solve those problems and giving them tools, sometimes just a manual of how to do it and how to get through the bureaucratic systems to make those changes, and sometimes actual technology platforms that let people do this. This is a great opportunity. This is a tremendous opportunity, and I think we have now in the culture an awareness that those kinds of participatory bottom-up peer networks can work. that people are willing to try things now because of the success that we can point to with things like the internet and the web and Wikipedia and Kickstarter. So that part of the kind of landscape I find really enthusiastic, really inspiring and exciting, and there are a million different projects that are working in that way. The final kind of rung of the argument then is, if you believe in these things, if you believe in the power of these kinds of new institutions, then where does that put you on the political spectrum? This is kind of where we began. I think people who believe in the power of these systems take very seriously the kind of the libertarian idea that was first kind of most powerfully formulated by Hayek, which is that decentralized systems in the long run will kind of outperform centralized systems. Because the world is so complex, the society is so complex, the economy is so complex, that no small group of planners or kind of generals or people in charge of the whole thing can possibly understand the complexity of that universe. And so systems like marketplaces tend to work better because each participant in the marketplace doesn't have to understand the whole. You don't have to have that kind of information bottleneck where you have to condense the whole thing down to something that a small group of people can understand. All the marketplace needs is individuals looking at some part of the society, some part of the economy. And if you create a system that allows exchange and cooperation and competition between all those different agents, you'll end up being much more effective than this kind of bottleneck of the state or of the central planners. So on the one hand, I think that folks who are kind of championing these kinds of systems take that critique very seriously. But they aren't libertarian in the sense that they don't think that the market solves all the problems in the world, and that there are many things in society that we need non-market forces to help us solve. And there are many cases where non-market agencies and collaborative structures can do better than the market. The history of the internet and the web and so many of the technologies that we rely on is probably the most articulate case for that. So these folks who kind of believe in that kind of progressive tradition and community building and bottom up and believe in that, at the same time, that kind of Hayek-influenced belief in the power of decentralization, who are those people, right? They're not big government people. They're not big capital people. So in the book, I'm starting to call these people pure progressives. And they're folks who are working kind of outside the traditions of the left and the right, but I think they've got a building kind of track record now that is actually generating results and that we can point to and say, this kind of approach actually works. And I'll leave you, we can open up to conversation, but I'll tell you just one story that's maybe my favorite story of the whole book, which took place right here in this neighborhood. And it's an example of how a government agency can work with a peer network to actually solve problems in cities. And it involves the incredible 311 service that the city has pioneered here and done. There's 311 in many cities around the country, but no one does it better than New York. And it's one of Bloomberg's big projects. What happens when you have a nerd mayor? You get things like 311. But 311 is absolutely one of the great advances in kind of urban living and kind of civic culture that I think we've seen in the last decade or two. So as most of you know, 311 works on a couple of levels. 311 takes kind of call volume off of 911. So you can call 311 if there's a problem the authorities should know about, but it's not a life or death emergency. So if somebody's breaking into your house, you still call 911. But if there's like a homeless person asleep by a playground, well, then you can call 311. So it reduces call volume on 911, which is helpful. But the big thing is that it functions as kind of an information concierge for the city, right? So anybody can call in and say, hey, our school's closed today. Is it alternate side parking? I need a battered women's shelter. I'm looking for a kids event in Prospect Park. And they'll get a live human being in 30 seconds. They speak over 180 different languages. Not one person. They all speak. Some of them speak some languages, others speak other. And they know the answer to kind of, they figured out, 95% of the questions are actually, a small subset of potential questions. So they have a lot of the answers kind of pre-canned. But they can get you to people who know the answers throughout the government infrastructure as well. So you get a human being. They've done all this quality testing on the call centers, and they actually perform, they have the customer satisfaction that is very top, And the only thing that's competitive with them are kind of high-end hotel chains in terms of customer service, in terms of a call center. They greatly outperform other government institutions like the IRS. If you call the IRS, they don't do nearly as good a job. And at the bottom of the list in terms of call center customer satisfaction are the cable companies. So you actually have a government agency that's responding to customers in this way. But here's the big thing. Every question and observation and data point that comes in through 311 is being tagged and geotagged and mapped and categorized by the city. So people can call in and report potholes, as Bloomberg apparently likes to do. They can come in and complain about a bar down the street that's making too much noise. And all those complaints and all those requests and all those questions get tagged and mapped. And so the city has this kind of constantly adapting dashboard that shows them the needs of this vast city of 8 million people. Right? This is a classic information overload problem. How do you figure out where the problems are in a city that big? And the old way of doing it would be like, okay, you'd hire a bunch of experts who'd be on the city payroll who would go around and look for potholes and look for problems and report back to headquarters. In the new model, in the peer network model, you deputize anyone who can dial 3 numbers on a phone and allow them to be part of this process. You greatly decentralize and diversify the number of people involved in this kind of problem-solving routine. Again, very similar to the insight of PageRank. Don't hire a bunch of archivists and librarians to organize the internet. Let anybody who can organize the internet by just linking from one site to another be part of this process. And it's been a huge success. The city is much more responsive to these needs, and they've fielded over 100 million calls. It just works, and it's created by government. So it's not that the government is should be rendered obsolete by these systems. But what the government is doing is saying, no, we want to create networks that allow far more people to be part of this process. And the best case study of this happened right here, and I experienced it firsthand many years ago walking around this neighborhood. There was this very bizarre thing where every now and then certain neighborhoods on the west side of Manhattan would smell like maple syrup. And you'd be walking down the street and, in the West Village, and all of a sudden you'd be like, oh my God, it smells like pancakes. Like, what is going on? And you would walk for blocks and blocks and blocks, and there'd be this total saturated smell of maple syrup. This started around 2004, and, it's post 9/11 New York. People are nervous about this kind of thing. They're worried it's like a chemical attack or something like that, so from like the, Aunt Jemima wing of Al-Qaeda. And so they start calling in 311. 311 had just started about a year before, so they're calling into 311, and like, it smells like pancakes in Chelsea. What's going on? And so the city sent out, kind of inspectors to test the air, and the air was fine and safe, and so they encouraged people. They told the 311 operators, if people call in, just tell them it's fine. They should enjoy the smell. It's not going to hurt them. But it kept happening. And the Times wrote about it, and local bloggers wrote about it. It would happen every couple of months in a slightly different neighborhood, but all on the west side. And it became so common an occurrence that inside of 311, the city began calling these things maple syrup events, capital M, capital S, capital E, which is like the worst thriller you've ever gone to, the maple syrup event. And so it kept happening, and then finally, years later, someone inside of 311 said, wait a second, all these calls that we've been getting over the years, these are clues, right? They're not just people freaking out about terrorists. They're clues. We can solve this riddle of where these smells are coming from. And so they went back. They had all the data kind of roughly in terms of neighborhood of where the calls were coming from in past MSEs. And they instructed their operators when the next one erupted to get exact kind of geo-coordinates, like cross streets of where the callers were coming from. And they aggregated all this data, and when they kind of built into the model the prevailing wind patterns for each day that the MSE had happened, it created this incredibly clear vector that just pointed back directly to this one location in New Jersey. The smells were coming from New Jersey. I'm not saying they were bad smells. They just were coming from New Jersey. And so they literally saw this point in the map, and they drove their van, across the bridge and went to this point in New Jersey where they found that there was a kind of artificial flavor and scent plant that every now and then would process the fenugreek seed, which is used in many cuisines in the world, but in a US supermarket, you're most likely to find it on the shelf where they sell cheap maple syrup knockoffs. What I love about this story is, yes, it was not a chemical attack, right? It was not a life or death matter. But when they were designing 311, nobody said, the other thing the service should be good at is if there's a syrupy smell in Manhattan, we should be able to use it to trace the origins of it. But because the system was this decentralized, diverse peer network, because it allowed anybody on the street who was experiencing something they had a mechanism to report it. And there was a mechanism for looking at all that data and analyzing all that data. The system turned out to be extremely good at both noticing this problem and ultimately kind of solving the mystery of where it came from. And that, I think, is the great power of these kinds of systems. And it's something we've seen again and again and again in the technology world. When you invite more people to participate in the process, what Tim O'Reilly calls the architecture of participation, and when you have more kind of diverse groups of people participating in the process, and you give all those individuals a voice, and you give them a platform where they can point out what's bothering them, whether it's a serious kind of urban crisis or whether it's a maple syrup smell. In the long run, those systems are not just kind of touchy-feely nice because everybody gets a voice. In the long run, they will outperform the alternatives. And one of the ways they outperform is by coming up with new solutions or observing new problems that the original creators never dreamed of. That's where they get this kind of extraordinary innovative power that can solve problems that we didn't even know we were going to have to solve when we were designing the service in the first place. And so when you have government-sponsored institutions, in general, like city governments have not been a hotbed of innovation over the course of the last century. But when we have examples to point to like 311, and we have examples to point to from either the private sector like Kickstarter or that kind of middle zone like so much of the technology that we use today, neither private sector nor government created, I think it makes a very good case that we're onto something and that there is really a new opportunity here, inspired by the internet, sometimes using the internet, sometimes using technology, but most of all using this way of organizing the world. So I hope with this book is just designed very explicitly to be the start of something. It's a fun book to write because it's in a sense a book about something that hasn't fully happened yet. There are a lot of stories in it. It's driven by narratives. It's not a book of abstract political theory. But I mostly wrote it, and I wrote it to be short and timely and to get it out there because I wanted to kind of capture what I saw happening around me. But mostly I wanted it to be its own little platform. And my kind of dream for this project is that folks will read it, and then 3 or 4 years from now, I'll hear somebody say, oh, I used that idea and that platform and that way of looking at the world to solve this other problem, which had not occurred to me at all. That will be the sign of its success, is if it actually triggers things that actually were not part of my blueprint at all. So if you can be one of those people, if Google can be one of those organizations, that would make me incredibly happy. And thank you again for having me come visit. Appreciate it. So if there are any questions, I think probably people want to go to the microphone, right? Because this is being recorded. So if anybody has, and by the way, I'm very happy to hear other stories from your experience or inside or outside of Google that resonate with what I've been talking about instead of just a question. Or you can just tell me stories about your own personal life if you'd like as well. Yes.
Hello.
Hey.
Thanks for being here. I don't
pleasure.
have a story about my personal life. But I'm curious on your thoughts around sort of the risks of imperfect or flawed platforms. And the Kickstarter example is a good one because it's been in the news a lot recently. Well, yeah. It's been on the internet news a lot recently, yeah. Where they've made some changes to the way that they're sort of allowing programs into the platform. So you can use that specific example, or if there's other examples that you encountered sort of where good intentions can lead us astray. It's something that we kind of keep in the back of our minds, I think, at Google, because we are building these platforms.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. So, and I do try and talk about this a little bit in the book, although I'm also trying to be, provocatively utopian in what the book is saying, because I feel like we need a little bit of that right now. But it's not as if you set up a kind of decentralized network and let everybody participate and you're golden, right? I mean, what happens when you create much more diverse, kind of unplanned networks is it introduces, by definition, it introduces more noise and kind of chaos into the system. The beautiful thing about perfectly planned environments is, they're very controlled. They may be nightmares, but they don't have that kind of ragged noisiness. And when you open up a platform to anybody, that means that it's filled with all sorts of cranks and people with an agenda and scam artists and people who are trying to abuse the system in one way or another, or people who are just wrong and misguided in their views and are trying to steer it with good intentions in the wrong way, right? So to that, I think you have to take that seriously, and it means that you have to design the architecture of these things so that they, kind of subdue that as much as possible. And this is exactly what Kickstarter is trying to do right now. They're an experiment, and they're constantly going to be tweaking things, just as Google has been, tweaking PageRank to deal with people trying to exploit it, from almost day one. It's an inevitable part of the process. The two things I've been saying to people when this comes up are, one, these are also the objections that people make about democracies, right? We've decided in general, most of us around the world, that despite the fact that democracies open up the voting process to cranks and scam artists and people who are just wrong, that in the long run they're better than these other systems because they involve a much more diverse makeup of decision makers that better represent the needs of the overall population. And so it doesn't mean that democracies work the second you set them up, and you have to be constantly kind of tinkering with them. And the other example, I think, is Wikipedia, right? And this is one of the places where I think the media has been, I think they've skewed things by focusing disproportionately on the places where Wikipedia fails. In the book, I kind of say it's a bit like aviation history, right? The news with aviation should be the astonishingly large number of, a high percentage of flights that, take off and land with, perfect safety, rather than the plane crash. But of course, we cover the plane crash. The same thing with Wikipedia. The incredible news every day should be, this thing works 99.99% of the time. It's amazing that it works. And yes, every now and then, there are articles where somebody has abused that platform, said something libelous, said something insane. But they've, over time, built this kind of social architecture that encourages more truth and less falsehoods. And the system itself kind of trends towards more accuracy, despite it not having any traditional kind of top-down experts deciding things. So each problem, each network is going to be kind of unique. The problem of a neighborhood self-organizing and creating a peer network to solve its needs is going to probably be different from a global encyclopedia. But I think there probably are some kind of common threads that we can learn and kind of best practices that we can apply to kind of deal with those problems. But it does involve a certain lack of control and a certain increase in noise and unpredictability to the system for sure. But I think we've gotten smart enough to figure out ways around some of those problems. Yes?
It's interesting when you talk about peer-based networks, and there's a difference between the way Kickstarter works and the way Wikipedia works. And that's, to me, in the term of authorship, ownership, and credit. So recognition that I did this project. Wikipedia doesn't seem to have that. You don't take pride in saying, I edited that. It's just for you to enjoy. And similar behavior comes in when you think about internet memes. So I made an internet meme about hipster kitty. I laugh at it. I don't expect the world to know that I made it. But that's not the model with Kickstarter, where there's two kinds of recognition. There's one of the artist or the maker who says, I made this project, give me the money. If I get the money, I'm going to make it. And then you go and there's this social cachet that you get. I backed this gaming console, and so I'm great. So what do you think is the balance of that, and where do you see that heading, especially when it comes to governments and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good, important observation, which I didn't kind of fully address in the book. The common theme to that is this idea, again, which is not news inside of Google, is that people will be motivated by a much wider range of rewards than traditional economics believes. Dan Pink has written about this a little bit in Drive, where it's like sometimes when you offer money, you get less motivation. People are like, no, I want esteem. I want the recognition of my peers, for instance, is to use the word peer again, can be a big driver. And so what all of these systems have showed us in real kind of vivid practical success stories is that the tools that are available the rewards that are available to incentivize people to participate there's a much kind of wider range. Everything from we'll give you $2 to you will silently know that you made this entry on Wikipedia about the Challenger explosion slightly better by fixing that one sentence. And you'll have that personal kind of sense of it. To me, I think the amazing thing about Wikipedia is that it works as well as it does with so little recognition. I think probably with Kickstarter they wanted to, and it may partially be because Kickstarter is a site that started post Facebook and Twitter, whereas Wikipedia predates all of that. And so they went into it assuming that all your activities would be amplified and shared in some kind of public way, and that you could use that, hey, I just backed this project on Kickstarter, aren't I awesome, to incentivize people to back more projects on Kickstarter. And it would be very interesting to see what would have happened. It's kind of a cool thought experiment, which has not kind of run through in my head, so I don't have the answer, but what Wikipedia would look like if it had been created post Facebook and Twitter. But it does kind of amaze me that Wikipedia gets as much participation as it does, given that the reward is so, kind of genuinely slight. Any others?
So in this peer-based model, where do you see experts? What's their role? Is it different, or is it? Oh, well, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I think there is a role for experts. Look, I don't want to be disingenuous about this. I didn't crowdsource the book, right? I mean, I wrote it as an individual author, and it is a book that is very much kind of connective, and it's drawing upon ideas and projects that have inspired me. And part of what I do is just relay that news in the book. But I still feel like books happen to be a form that generally work better if there's one author than other forms. So there are cases where individuals with a certain message, particularly a kind of a structure of an argument or a storytelling form, generally, for complicated reasons that I don't totally have an answer for, generally have worked better with one person doing it than with a crowd doing it. So it's not that the crowd can kind of solve everything. And in terms of experts, what I think has started happening, and this is one of the things that's been an enduring success of what we used to call the blogosphere, is actually, again, kind of extending the realm of expertise. I noticed this a lot in the financial crisis, and I read about this a little bit in the book, leading up into the election in 2008. That one of the things that was there then that wasn't there, for instance, when there was the recession before Clinton was elected, and there was a lot of talk about politics and how either party were going to fix the economy. You had a certain number of experts that would show up, on the pages of the Wall Street Journal or the pages of the New York Times, op-ed pages, and you had a political class of kind of pundits who would talk about these issues on CNN or something like that. But by 2008, what you had was this amazing new cast in the middle there of academics, actually economists who were working, at schools, who were actually kind of trained in the field, who were not necessarily pundits, who were not going on these shows, but had an extraordinary amount of expertise, actually more expertise than most of the people who'd been on television before, who now, thanks to blogging, were able to kind of weigh in on all these topics and give us both some guidance and interpretation from that kind of point of view without having to kind of fight their way onto the op-ed page of the New York Times. And so it's not that the experts were gone. It wasn't that, we were like, okay, crowd, decide whether the McCain plan or the Obama plan is better for getting us out of this mess, or explain why Lehman Brothers collapsed. The crowd is not going to answer that. But what we have now is a much wider pool of those informed experts to draw upon. And that's that's, again, a place where, blogging seems so kind of passé now, but, when you go to a good blogger who's a great curator of interesting links to things, and you can sit down with them and see, something they've put together of all these different economo bloggers who are out there kind of writing about these issues, that's an incredible resource that we just did not have 10 or 15 years ago. And it's in part because it's amplifying the voices of experts, but it's created a much bigger pool of experts. All right. Thank you so much for visiting, and I'm happy to sign books, and I really appreciate you guys coming out. Appreciate it.